Well, thank you to the Broward County Bar Association, particularly Braulio Rosa, its executive director. I'm pleased to introduce our guest for the afternoon. This my first podcast. I think it's your first podcast
My
as well.
first podcast.
This is my mother, the Honorable Miette K. Burnstein. Those of you who are my age or older, I'm 59, will know my mother, know who she is. Those of you who are younger may not, so you'll get to know her over the next few minutes. She was a circuit judge, Broward County circuit judge, from 1977 through 2007. Now, here's the preamble, Mom.
Okay, I'm ready.
In preparation for this, I did a search of Sun Sentinel archives, and I input your name, your first name, which is very unique. There's no other Miettes. And in a minute, tell us where that comes from. I don't even remember the derivation of it. I think I do. But there were 455 articles between January of 1985 and today, which is a lot. Then when I looked at the Miami Herald archives, there were more than 1,000 articles or mentions of your name, and that goes back to even before your wedding. We found the article about you and Dad getting married. I didn't search the Daily Business Review. I didn't search the Sun Sentinel. And by the way, just as another preamble, ChatGPT formed the artificial intelligence plugin, formed many of these questions. I'll let you know. And they're good questions. I put in the database of 20 Sun Sentinel articles, so some of those questions. Okay, before we begin, here's the toughest question, but I know the answer to it. Since you're on video, you haven't been sworn, but aren't I your favorite child? It's time to. I think it's time to tell Carrie. Let Carrie know.
Well, as a matter of fact, I got a birthday card from my daughter that said, "Happy Mother's Day" or "Happy Birthday" from your favorite child. And then when you open it up, it says, "I am your favorite child, aren't I?" This is an argument that's been going on between my son and my daughter my whole life.
And sometimes we get you the same card
Right.
accidentally. Okay, so Mom, you are known in the legal community for many firsts. Why don't you explain and describe what those firsts are?
The first, it goes back a long, long way. It goes back all the way to Brown versus Board of Education. You remember that was the case that overruled the doctrine, the segregation doctrine of separate but equal. And I was in high school in those days. Believe it or not, there was a time when I was in high school. And they were all talking about this case. And in my business law class, the teacher had us separated into two parts. The people who believed that Brown versus Board of Education, which said that separate but equal was unconstitutional, and those that said it was not unconstitutional. Well, in those days, I was in Broward County going to school at South Broward High School, and me and one other person were on the side of it has to be overruled. And the whole entire class was on the other side. And I explained when they asked us why we were on this side all by ourselves, why we felt that way. And I said, because ultimately the very idea of separate means it is not equal. And I explained why I thought that was the case. Well, everybody else, sort of passed it along. And a few days later, when the Supreme Court came out with their decision, I was gratified to know that they not only agreed with me, but even the reasoning was somewhat similar. So I was thrilled to pieces, and that's when I decided I was going to be a lawyer. And ultimately, when we all graduated, we had a caricaturist who came to our school to do caricatures of all of us kids. And my caricaturist said to me, "What do you want to be when you grow up, or what do you want to be in life?" And I said, "I'd like to be a lawyer." And he painted or drew my caricature as a judge in a robe with a defendant in striped clothing pleading with me. And I thought that was very unusual because I never said I wanted to be a judge. But after that, it sort of sparked an idea in my mind that, well, maybe that's something I should go for. So I've had this hope and dream for a very long time.
So go back to your first. In 1976, you were the first female circuit judge of the history of Broward County.
Right.
One
right.
thing that I learned like a couple of hours ago, I
Yeah.
probably did realize, but I forgot, that you were, if not the first, were you the first Jewish
Yes.
judge in Broward Circuit?
The first Jewish judge in the circuit. Mort Abram was the first judge in the county, first Jewish judge in the county. But I was the first Jewish judge in the circuit and the first female. So,
And what other firsts? There are others.
let's see what other. Well, I was first, obviously the first woman elected to the circuit judge, to the circuit post. I had applied a couple of times before the committee to get my name out there for an appointment. And of course, all these male judges or these male lawyers kept saying, "Oh yeah, that's good. You can do a great job, but we don't not now, not yet." So they kept saying this for 3 years. I was asking them to put my name out, and for 3 years they said, "Yeah, we'll do it one of these days." And finally, when there was a spot that opened for election, I said, "Well, the heck with this. I'm going to go power to the people. I'm going to go to the people and say I want to be a judge." And the people came through.
Well, you were also chief judge.
I was first
When was that? And you were the first female chief
female,
judge.
about 7 or 8 years after I was on the bench.
And didn't you, weren't you a chief judge for more terms?
At that time, traditionally, the chief judge had served 1 term. But I think John Ferris served 2 terms, and I served 2 terms.
No, I think you served 3.
Maybe I served 3, I don't remember. But anyway, that was a long time ago. Since then, there have been many chief judges that have served multiple terms, but at that time, it was a new concept.
And at the statewide level, you have some
And
firsts as well.
and at the statewide level, there were 400 and some odd judges throughout the state at that time, circuit judges. And I decided I wanted to be the chair of the Circuit Judges Conference. So that's what I did. I ran for election for that, and I was the first woman head of the Circuit Judges Conference. So I was proud of that.
Okay, so let's go back, and here are a couple of Chat GPT questions. Let's go back to,
Okay.
to 1976, the election.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I know during lunch we were talking about this because I remember some of these events, kind of funny events. All right, so take these in whatever order you want. What motivated you to run to be the first female circuit judge? And what motivated you to run against 2 better-known male lawyers? One of them had already been a sitting municipal judge.
Yeah, Harvey Ford. Yeah, as a matter of fact, not only did I decide to run at that time, but Harvey filed against me. I had filed first. And when Harvey Ford filed in my race, he came over and we were friendly. And he said, "Don't run for this spot, run for another spot." I said, "There's no other spot that I fit into, and this is the one I wanted." So he was a little distressed, but I'm happy to tell you that after the election, we all made up for it. And when he got married, I was the only judge he invited to the wedding, so I was kind of pleased about that.
He ultimately became a county court judge as well.
Yes, he became a county court judge shortly after that.
Now, I don't remember whether it was in 1976, so I was 12 years old. I don't know whether it was the general election or the runoff, but I remember one of those nights pretty vividly. What do you remember about election night or things leading up to the election?
Well, that was very interesting because the whole county was changing in its voters and the demographics of their voters. And so I was primarily campaigning where I thought I would do the best, which was in the condos. The condos at that point were being built on the west side of the county. In fact, we used to call it the Big L because it was on the west side of the county and then across to Hallandale. And I thought that's where I should expend most of my energy. And I did, and it paid off because downtown Fort Lauderdale was always so conservative, and I thought I would not do as well there. I did well there, but not as well. And downtown Lauderdale was always the home of the silk shirt lawyers, and they were always the hot shots, and I was not one of them. So
Well, also your opponents were
Yeah.
basically Fort
Well,
Lauderdale insiders.
not only Fort Lauderdale insiders, but one of them, Hull,
Floyd Hall.
Floyd Hall.
Oh, the stadium, the baseball stadium.
Yeah, Floyd Hall had a very impressive resume in downtown Fort Lauderdale, including sponsoring or building or something with the baseball stadium. And every baseball game, they would get up there and they would say, vote for Floyd Hall for circuit judge. And I thought, oh my gosh, all those baseball players, I'm done. So downtown Fort Lauderdale was not going to be my heavily voter population that would support me. And downtown Lauderdale in general would not support me. A lot of the aspects of downtown Lauderdale were still anti-Semitic, which may carry through to today, I don't know, but it was not an easy task for me to be very heavily supported in downtown Lauderdale. So when the votes came in, I was waiting for the big L, the condos on the west, the condos across the south, and I knew that that's where my votes would be. So when we went out for dinner that night.
This I remember. I remember being out for dinner, and because it was primarily Dad's thinking, this is back in the day where the election results would come into the courthouse lobby. They would
Right.
handwrite them. Remember, they would handwrite them.
right.
And they would come in from the closest in proximity, geographic
Right.
proximity. And we were out to dinner, and you were primarily, because this is who you are, were anxious to get to the courthouse, and Dad kept delaying, kept
Yeah.
thinking of any excuse, because he knew if we got there, the early returns, you were going to be behind. So he just kept delaying and didn't pay the bill, and finally pays the bill, and we got there, and I think you were still behind, but you could see the returns from the
They were
farther reaches
starting
of the
to come
county
in.
coming in.
Yeah, I do remember that my father joined us to watch the elections because everybody was very anxious to see what was going to happen with me. And my father said when the central Fort Lauderdale votes came in, well, Miette, you have a lovely home, a lovely family, a lovely husband, 2 lovely children. What do you need this for? And I said, save your sympathy for Harvey Ford because I'm going to win this thing. And lo and behold, he just stood there with his mouth hanging open as the votes from the condos came in.
Right. Do you remember Friedman Satz Bernstein Katz?
Yes, yes.
So that was 76 was an important year though, because Mike Satz, who was very young, Mike Satz was younger than you, I
Yes.
think. Yeah, he was young. Became state attorney. Al Schreiber.
Right. And Bob Lockwood became
Right.
clerk of the courts. I ran with some very impressive people.
Katz did not win, and
Friedman,
Charlie
Charlie
Friedman did
No,
not win either.
No.
Do you remember? I also remember. I don't remember his name, but your campaign manager. He kind of reminds me of like Mickey and Rocky, Burgess Meredith, this gravelly old guy. But he also. I know that Dad, you, and he came up with the L. You know, because I remember in our den there was a big map of the county with the L highlighted in terms of where you were going to focus to get votes.
Right.
Okay, so Chat GPT question. Can you share some of the challenges and triumphs you experienced during your campaign and after your election?
Well, some of the incidents that I experienced while I was campaigning was amazing. My husband was stunned with how I remembered people's names at the condos, and I worked very hard to remember all the people that I had met. So I wanted to remember their names so that they would obviously support me. But my husband once said, "It's amazing that you remembered so many names, but that you remembered that so-and-so's grandson applied to Harvard." And when I went out there to campaign again, I said, "Susan, did your son get into Harvard, grandson get into Harvard?" And she said, "Oh my God, how did you remember that?" So it was a real test of my memory because I tried so hard to remember all the people that I had met and things about them that would impel them to think that I was really something special, which I wasn't.
Do you think that, there was a lot of focus on you being the first female.
Yeah.
Do you think that in some way overshadowed the fact that you were also a Jewish Hungarian immigrant?
It must have overshadowed it because hardly anybody remembered it or hardly anyone ever mentioned it. The fact that I was female was pretty obvious. There weren't any female circuit judges, and I was the first, and that was obvious. But I guess my Hungarian Jewish lineage did not really come into play. And I never so-called played that card. I never said, "Oh, I'm a Hungarian refugee," and so have sympathy for me because we escaped Hungary on the footsteps of Hitler marching in. And so I never had to play that card, but I'm sure that there were some people who had that in mind, particularly other refugees. And in those days, there were still refugees coming in, so that helped too, or hurt, depending.
Well, 1976, I mean, it was,
Yeah.
it seemed like it did open the floodgates.
Yeah.
Because after your
Yeah.
election, I mean,
Yeah.
women flooded into the judiciary and.
And I hope that was credited to me.
And, well, so, another ChatGPT question. Did you feel a sense of responsibility or pressure as the first woman in your position? If so, how did you manage those feelings?
Yeah, I think you always feel pressure when people are expecting big things of you, and you know in your own heart that there's nothing special about you. So I worked very hard to make people believe that I was going to follow through on all the things I had promised, and follow through on the work categories that I felt were important. So I think that was the pressure, and I think I met it.
And who were your mentors, and were your colleagues supportive of you when you got to the bench?
Actually, you can really divide them just the way the vote was divided. I had a lot of mentors that were really very helpful. John Ferris among the most. He was the previous chief judge, and for some reason he just felt like I would be a good chief judge, and he campaigned for me, and he was just a super mentor. And of course I couldn't have any women mentors because there wasn't any. So I tried to listen as much as I could to the previous judges who were male and who were helpful, and there were plenty of them.
Well, one thing I remember, we're going to go into the early years, and I picked out a couple of cases from the newspaper clippings. I remember as a kid that in those early years, so I was in middle school and in high school, I remember you worked extraordinarily hard. And the reason I remember that is because dinner during the week was always Dad, sometimes Carrie.
Helter-skelter.
It was, we were going out to dinner, or we were bringing in, and Mom, who the heck knew where you were, whether you were going to join us or not. Sometimes you did, sometimes you didn't. What was the motivation, do you work hard because you're kind of a type A nut, or did you have...
I am a type A driven nut, but one of the things that I remember that was so funny, one of the newspaper reporters had asked Mitchell in particular, how has your mother's election affected you? I mean, here you are basically with a mother that's working very hard, and did she have enough time for you and whatever else? And Mitchell said, well, sometimes it's difficult. Sometimes we have dinner at 8. Sometimes we have dinner at 9. Sometimes we didn't have dinner at all. That was a little embarrassing. But, it was typical of my son, who at one point even said something like, when they interviewed him, what would you like to be when you grow up? Well, Mitchell only knew 2 women, both of whom were running for judges, me and my friend Pat Kokalis, who was running for county court. And they said, what would you like to do when you grow up? Fireman, policeman, what is it? And Mitchell turned to me and he said, Mom, can a boy be a judge? And then I knew I had made it. That was the whole reason I was doing this. So I figured I evened the score for men and women to be judges.
So there are 2, very early on, when I was going through the newspaper articles, there are 2, I'd like to focus on 2 cases that are really interesting that you dealt with, and then 2 incidents or events while you were chief judge. So before you were even a second-year judge, you hadn't even been on the bench 2 years,
Yeah.
and you had a first-degree murder case, and you imposed the death penalty.
Yeah.
And there was a lot in the paper about that.
Yeah.
What do you remember about that and your feelings? Because the newspaper showed that it was a very difficult thing.
Yeah, I remember a lot about that case because before I ran, or before I was elected, as I was running, the newspaper articles did ask me, probably because I was a woman, whether I would impose the death penalty, and did I believe in the death penalty. And at that time I said, well, I'm not really a fervent believer of the death penalty, and it would be very difficult for me, but I would do it because I had to do it, because I have to follow the law. That's what judges do. Whatever their personal feelings are, they are required to follow the law. So when George Victor Franklin, that was his name.
Yeah.
When he came before me, and we had a trial, and the trial was conducted like any normal trial. And when he got convicted, the jury's recommendation was unanimous that required a call for the death penalty. And it was hard for me, and I had a hard time doing it, but I did it because that was my job, and I had to do it. And afterwards, a lot of people came up to me and said, what do you think? The one who came up to me the most shocking was the defendant, who I had just sentenced to death, who came up to the dais and patted my hand. I think he felt it was difficult for me, too. But that was a hard thing to do. But I did it.
Were you remorseful or regretful in any way?
No, I did what I had to do, and it was an appropriate verdict. This was a fellow who was convicted of first-degree murder in another state and had escaped and came down here and committed another murder. And I felt that if anyone deserved it, this person did. So.
The other case, so you're on the bench for now less than 4 years.
Yeah.
And you presided over a matter which at the time would have been the largest jury award in state history by far, Mall versus Toyota, where
Yeah.
the Mall sisters were essentially...
That was so tragic.
They were three sisters, the accountant, a college student, and a high school student were incinerated alive.
It was such a tragic case. It was an automobile accident. It was a rather convoluted accident because there were other vehicles involved. But somehow or another, the Toyota was struck from behind, and it pushed the vent that comes out of the back of the Toyota into the front of the car, and it literally spewed fire into the car and burned alive 3 sisters. And to me, that was the most tragic thing in the whole entire world. To lose 1 child is tragic, but 3 is unimaginable. So that was a case that I remember well. And Shelley Schlesinger, I think, was the plaintiff, and Jim Smith from Wicker Smith was the defense lawyer. Both excellent lawyers, and the case was long, as can be imagined. And Shelley Schlesinger had brought into the courtroom a replica Toyota so that he could explain how it happened.
But didn't he cut the...
Yeah, he cut it in half.
He cut the actual car.
Oh, no, I don't think it was the
I thought it was the actual car that you brought.
It may have been. Anyway,
he cut something in half because he had trouble getting it into the courthouse.
Yeah, he finally got the car into the courthouse. And at that time, the only amusing thing that happened was that my brother at that time was elected judge. And he said to me one day, "Mia, where am I going to park my car today?" And I said, "Like Shelley Schlesinger does, in my courtroom." So it was a terribly tragic thing, and that's a hard thing to get over.
To this day, as you know, 3 of your grandchildren are my daughters, three daughters,
Right.
and I won't let them drive in a car together.
Right.
They don't. My 3 daughters do not drive in a car together.
I don't like them to fly together, but
No, that they have done, but they will not be in a car together.
once upon a time when I was learning to fly, at one point I was trying very hard to learn to fly because I was a little acrophobic. I'm a little afraid of heights, so I figured the best way to get over it is to learn to fly. So I did. I learned to fly, and after I got my license, I said to Mitchell, "You want to come flying with me?" He said, "Ma, I don't even like to drive with you."
I remember seeing that little plane at the airport, because Carrie went up with you.
Yes.
Dad, you guys traveled
Yes.
on the plane.
Yes.
And I said, "I'm not getting in it. I don't like driving with you." And it was like a tin can. It was like some 4-seat Cessna. I
Well,
said,
don't feel bad. It was a 4-seat Cessna. But my mother finally said, "Okay, I'll fly with you." And we got up in the air, and she promptly threw up.
I wasn't getting in a plane with you. I love you, Mom, but I don't like driving with you. I certainly wasn't going to fly with you. Okay, we'll get into a couple of hobbies in a minute, but one thing that I also didn't remember, but this is when I don't know if the Broward County Bar Association still does the judicial polls, but back in the day,
Yeah,
it did. And you were
they did.
always very highly rated, both in terms of
yeah.
judicial temperament and judicial ability. You were 4th. The both years I saw, you were the 4th highest in temper. Was that a big deal to you? Did you care about it?
Oh, I kept saying I didn't care, but the truth is that I did care. And the reason that I cared was because I felt that it was it was the lawyers saying, okay, you're okay with us. So I did it like that.
Well, just a funny story. About a year ago, a buddy of mine I went to law school with was a very prominent judge in Palm Beach County. He retired about a year ago, and he was always like right at the top for years and years. And we had dinner with another law school colleague, and he said, "You're damn right I cared. I lobbied for it. I called the Daily Business Review. I couldn't come in second. Every year I made sure I was up there."
Well, I didn't lobby for it because I didn't think that was quite right, but I was very happy to get it.
Okay, so before we get into the chief judge years, which we'll go through, you also had a reputation for some interesting hobbies
Yes.
and interesting vacations.
Yes.
Okay, so
Yes.
talk about the hobbies
Yes.
and the vacations I know about, but
Yeah,
not a lot of people know
right,
about.
Right. Well, my hobbies obviously was flying. I don't fly anymore, but I did then, and I enjoyed it, and it helped me get over some aspects of the acrophobia. And I also learned how to scuba dive because my husband was a scuba diver. I didn't like that either. Somehow or another, I like my feet on the ground, old terra firma. And then after I retired, almost the day after I retired, I started thinking, I should write a book. And I did. I wrote a book. It was totally fictional. I keep telling people, even though the protagonist was a woman judge, it was totally fictional. Nobody believed me, but it was. And I never could get it published as such, but Amazon.com has it digitally available. If you have a Kindle, by all means, write off for it. The book was called Dead Man's Tattoo, and it was written in my maiden name, Miette Korda, Korda. And I was kind of pleased with that. I got my first royalty check, and I could buy a hamburger with it. That was it. So if you want to buy it, I'll have another hamburger.
I thought was very funny, like you and Pat Kokals. Pat Kokals is no longer with us, but
Yeah, I know.
everyone in the courthouse knew
Yeah.
that the two of you, usually it was like once a year. would
Once a year for-
You would leave your husband's,
Yeah.
Laswell
Right.
would be, doing his thing. My dad would be doing his thing. You and Pat were going some exotic place,
Yes.
eating some
Yeah,
crazy food.
We did. We had a wonderful time. We went to practically every foreign place in the world. At first, I asked my husband to go, and Pat asked her significant other to go, and neither one of them wanted to go. So I said to Pat, "Well, then you and I can go. There's no reason why we can't go." And we did every year for about 25 years. We took a 7 to 10 day vacation to a foreign place. We went everywhere. We went to Vietnam. We went to India. We went to unimaginable South Africa. We went all over the place. Places most people just hear of, but we really enjoyed it. We had a great time together.
In Russia, when Judge Kokals brought a bag full of candy bars,
Well,
she would want to eat the food.
that's because when we went to, it was China that was the worst.
Oh,
When we went to China, and I was in a car being led by one of our guides, and next to me was riding a fella in a bicycle. And in the basket of his bicycle was a dog with 4 legs straight up. And I got kind of alarmed, and I said to our guide, "My gosh, this guy has, I think, a dead dog in his basket." And the guy said, "Oh, yes, and it'll make a fine meal for his family tonight." I said, "A meal? You mean they eat dog?" And he said, "Yes, absolutely." And I said to him, "Have you ever eaten dog?" And he said, "Oh, yes." And I said, "What does it taste like?" And he thought for a minute, and finally he said, "Like chicken." So we've had our share of eating adventures. After that, Pat and I only ate white rice and beer. That was what we lived on in China after that episode. But
So going into your years as chief judge, what prompted your decision to throw in your hat to become the first female chief judge in the circuit? And do you think that gender was an issue for your judicial colleagues who voted?
I really don't think gender was an issue. I may be naive. There may have been a male judge or two that didn't like the idea of a woman bossing them around, but I never felt there was that much of an issue. And a lot of the male judges felt like maybe it needed a softer touch, if that's what they were thinking. They were wrong, but they felt like maybe it needed a more ameliorative person who could compromise more. My opponent was known as a brusque, abrasive kind of judge who was a very nice guy, but it was tough on the other judges for him to handle. And I hopefully was more at ease with them. And I think I may have been, especially when I was the only judge, they always said, who worked so hard that I even took some of their cases and I helped them out when they needed it. So I think they appreciated that.
Well, there were two, I wouldn't even call them dust-ups during your time. They were blow-ups during your tenure as Chief Judge. Okay, so the first was, and there were, in both the Sun Sentinel and the Miami Herald.
You must be talking about Nick Navarro.
Well, that's one, but there were dozens of articles about each of these.
Okay.
So the first was really the jail overcrowding.
Okay.
And
I remember that.
The Broward County Commission threatened you with litigation. They
Yes.
threatened to name you as a
Yes.
defendant in a lawsuit.
Yeah.
How did you receive that threat, and what did you do about it?
Well, I responded by saying, would you have the separation of powers go awry? Because my job as the judiciary and representing the rest of the judiciary is that we would give a fair trial, that we would sentence where appropriate, and that sentence would be carried out by the executive branch, which is how it usually worked. Judges had no say as to the jails. We never said, nobody ever came to us and said, should we build a jail or should we, whatever. That was not the problem with the judiciary. Our focus was on giving a fair trial and on sentencing appropriately. And I felt when the commission said, well, let loose of some of these, or early release some of these defendants that your co-judges sentenced to relieve the overcrowding in the jails, I said, I am not going to do that. I think it's contrary to my job. My job is to put them in, not take them out. And they said, well, just, take out some of them. And I said, I'm not going to do it. You want to do it? You do it. But my job is to try them and sentence them appropriately. And my fellow judges' jobs is the same exact thing. And I'm not going to release any of them. So I didn't.
I don't think they ultimately sued you, but
No.
there was some.
No, they didn't. They knew they weren't going to win.
Right.
The appellate courts certainly know.
They were under the gun because Judge Hoovler had them under the gun, but
Right.
Instead of.
But at Truda County Commission, and true to any commission, they'd rather blame anybody in the world except themselves. And the truth of the matter was they didn't have enough jails. They didn't staff them appropriately. And that's their problem, not mine, not the judiciary's.
So this one also, and I even remember this. You demanded beefed up security by the Broward Sheriff's Office in 1987.
That was the Nick Navarro era.
And the sheriff responded by essentially closing down the courthouse
Yes.
for a couple of days.
Yes.
What led up? There was an
Okay.
incident in another courthouse, I think, that led
Well,
up to that.
the first thing happened maybe 4 or 5 years before that. Nick Navarro had applied to the county commission for extra money for extra security. And they had always offered him extra money and for everything. Whatever Nick Navarro's budget demanded, they gave him. So then later, as time went on, I said to the sheriff, I said, look, you've been given this extra money to beef up security and to do your job. Please do it. And now that you've got the money to do it, there's no reason not to. And then what happened was about a year before this, the dust-up, there was a judge, I think, and possibly a juror murdered in one of the upstate courthouses. So I was really upset about that. And as I told Nick Navarro, I said, look, we need extra security. It's not just for the judges. I'm not that worried about the judges. We can take care of ourselves. We have bailiffs and what have you. But I'm concerned about the litigants, the jurors, the people who work with these people. They're innocent victims. They have should have no fear about serving on a jury or anything like that. We need the security. And he said, yeah, I'll get to it. Well, that was like a year before, and he hadn't gotten to it. And I said to him, if you don't give me this extra security for the courthouse, I'm going to order you to do it. And he said, yeah, yeah. So I did. And in response, the sheriff closed all the doors to the courthouse except one, and had people come in one at a time, where he had one of his sheriffs pat us down or pat somebody down and examined everything they were carrying, including one lipstick case from one of the people who was trying to get in. And the whole courthouse was inundated. There were lines around the block, and we couldn't get anything done. And I was in one of those lines. And the sheriff came out to me. He says, if you want to come in, we'll let you in. I said, I'm standing out here with everybody else. I get the same treatment as everybody else. You're not going to secure them. You're not going to secure me.
Did you?
It was a big problem.
Yeah. I mean, after a couple of days.
Yeah.
I mean, wasn't he held in contempt?
No. At that point, I said, if you're not going to do this, I'm going to talk about holding you in contempt. And he said, yeah. So I appointed Arthur Franza, who had been my rival in the chief judge race. I said, Arthur, you handle this. You wanted to be chief judge? You handle this, because I'm already compromised, and I didn't want anybody to say, well, she wasn't fair because she didn't like him, which was true. So Arthur Franza handled it. And he came out with the famous line to Nick Navarro, be a good Nick, not a God Nick. And the paper's like that, too. I thought it was strange, but there's no accounting for reporters.
Did you ever make peace with Nick Navarro?
With Nick? I didn't have to make peace with him. He was defeated the very next election, and rightfully so. And the papers even said that he was high-handed, which he was.
Well, you acknowledged that you would have done things differently as well.
Yeah, well, I would have. I probably would not have caused him to shut the courthouse down, although at that point I'm not sure whether he would have anyway.
But ultimately, did you accomplish what you set forth to accomplish?
Yeah, ultimately, I think the county commission stuck it to him. They sort of said, look, we gave you some extra money, so use it for what you want. And he did.
Let's, I have, again, some more Chat GPT questions and sort of reflections back on your accomplishments in career.
Yeah.
You've mentioned, well, we talked about Jewish Hungarian immigrant. You've mentioned that your parents' experiences fleeing Nazi expansion.
Yeah.
You came here when you were 2.
Yeah.
From Hungary.
Yeah.
Nurtured your drive towards judicial service.
Yeah.
Can you share more about how their experiences and stories shaped your career path?
It probably ought to be evident that leaving a country, even though I was too little at that time to recognize it, but as years went on and as I read and heard stories and what have you, I realized that leaving a country that doesn't have the rights that the United States had, that had Nazism, that was persecuting Jews and innocent people, gays, everything. They were just persecution complex, crazy. That this country doesn't have that sort of thing, or at least I hope they don't have it, although lately I sometimes wonder. But it doesn't have the kind of recognition of these violent prejudices that all of Europe had at that time. So I think it makes me more sensitive to that.
And well, when you were here, you were 2. You grew up, Hungarian was spoken in the house, right?
Yes.
And you had no money.
No money.
In Dania Beach, where you guys?
Dania Beach was where we lived. In fact, some of the people from Dania still refer to me as that Dania girl. You know, that's where I went to the first grade at Dania Elementary, and that was my early childhood.
Do you think that you sacrificed things to accomplish what you did professionally?
Sure. It's very time-consuming. So one of the things that I sacrificed was the ability to be with my children all the time, which I missed. But I did my best, and they grew up great, so I must have done something right. We used to call it at that time benign neglect, because it forced the kids to do on their own, and they did. They grew up very responsibly, and I'm very proud of them,
And
especially me.
yeah, this is a tougher one. Um, Dad would have turned 93 this week,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah,
and he passed away in August.
yeah.
What role did he play in your professional trajectory and
Well,
accomplishments?
the most important role that he played was that he was not a male chauvinist. He always credited women with being able to do whatever men could do, which was greatly appreciated by me because I always felt that way too. But he was very supportive, and he did whatever he could do. He planted signs all over when I was running for election and bolstered me and pepped me up when things didn't look so wonderful. And he was a supportive husband, and a heck of a good father because he had to take the place of a mother sometimes.
And finally, looking back at your career, what are some of the key moments or decisions that you made that you believe defined your path? What were the key points?
Well, you've already mentioned some of them, and I think, by and large, sitting on the bench is in itself a defining path, because every day you're met with people that have enormous problems, and if you can help them resolve their problems, that's a very good path to find. I still remember one time a young girl came to me with her mother, and she wanted a permission from her father to marry her lover. She was 16, I think, and he was 19 or whatever, and she was pregnant. And in those days, you couldn't get an abortion unless both your parents signed a consent, and her father would not sign the consent. And so they had to go to the court to get the consent. And the mother said, look, she's a very mature child, and she loves this boy, he loves her, and I see no reason why they shouldn't get married. And I said, neither do I. So I signed the consent. So things like that, I think you step in the shoes of people that have had hard times. And if you can make their life easier, that's a wonderful way to go. So
Anything that we didn't cover that you want to mention?
let me see. Let's see, I think we've covered just about everything.
Well, Mom, thank you. Thank you to Braulio. Thank you to Anthony. Thank you, Mark. Thank you for anyone who is watching or listening. And thank you, Mom.
Thank you, son.